Thank you guys so much for coming. I know that this is maybe not the same as some amazing presentations that we've had recently, but I mean, I've really enjoyed the last couple of months getting to learn about these awesome topics in philosophy. I am a comparative literature major through and through. Like everything you teach me still comes back to books. So this is about a book. The book is called The History of Love. It's by Nicole Krauss. And I just think it's a phenomenal book. And I got really interested in silence in this book. My partner pointed out to me when I was sort of talking about silence and like thinking through this, that there's a meme about this. It sort of came up recently. I don't know if you guys watched the interview between Oprah and Meghan Markle. Were you silent or were you silenced? But I think that this is sort of a common idea that people think about, that silence is like this way of being cut off from people. Because in the interview, it's all about how Markle is feeling isolated by the royal sort of crown or whatever, not letting her speak out and like be her true self. So on the one hand, in the history of love, I think that there are lots of examples of this being the case where people are really silenced. I'm going to sort of speed through the first like 8 pages of my paper and get to the sort of meaty stuff at the end because I just don't have time for it all. But in the history of love, there are 2 main characters. The one of them is Leo. He in the book is about he's in his 80s. He's a Holocaust survivor. And the other is named Alma, and she's actually named after a character in a book that was originally written by Leo but published by this guy Zvi, who sort of plagiarized him. So young Alma and old Leo, and young Alma is named after a character who's named after Leo's first love, old Alma Meriminsky. And she sort of wields silence as this tool. She kind of brings people in with it, and she also pushes them away. And she also keeps Leo essentially in silence for a lot of his life, because at the beginning of their relationship, he wants to take a picture with her where they look coupley. She says no. She says she doesn't want people finding out about them. So she sort of makes this a secret. And then she goes off to the new world. She has Leo's baby with this other guy. Leo finally comes after this whole traumatic experience to America. He finds her. She says, oh yeah, you do have a kid, but you can't tell anyone. Like, this kid's father is my new husband. Like, you don't know anything. You're nobody. And so Leo sort of lives in this state of being silenced, partly by the Nazi regime and by the way that Jews were treated in Europe at the time, and partly by this woman who sort of used silence as a tool to silence Leo. So one thing that is maybe important to think about at this point is silence versus secrets. So a secret is often perpetuated not by complete silence, right? As we all know, like Meghan Markle is a good example. The crown told her not to be totally silent in the face of everyone, but to say no comment. So a lot of secrets are kept not by pure silence, but just by like saying different things. So I think that this is a moment in the history of love where we see some really interesting sort of cyclical relationships between silence and secret keeping. So this is a quote that I love and find really interesting. If Zvi coughed more and more as the years passed, a hacking cough that shook his whole body, causing him to bend over double and made it necessary for him to excuse himself from dinner tables, refuse phone calls, and turn down the occasional invitation to speak, it wasn't so much because he was ill as that there was something he wished to say. So I think that this is really interesting because you see this relationship between silence and secret keeping where the secret in his body actually like creates this inability to speak, this sort of physical change in him with the coughing, where he's actually like, he's trying not to speak because of the silence, but then he's actually unable to speak as well because he's been silenced. So, okay, this is another quote. This is Leo, who, as we know, has been sort of made into a non-person over the course of his life. And he comes face to face finally with his son, who of course he wants to tell the truth to. He sort of has been revolting his whole life, wanting people to see him. And finally he's standing in front of his son and he's not able to say, you know, the truth, which is, hey, I'm your father. I love you and I'm proud of you, right? Like he can't do it. So this is, I think, a really interesting quote. I'm just going to read it really quick. he says, I tried to say something, but there was no sound. He smiled and thanked me, and yet I didn't budge. Is there something else? He asked. I flapped my hands. The woman behind me gave me an impatient look and pushed forward to greet him. The son is like a famous author. This is at a book signing. Like a fool, I flapped. What could he do? He signed the woman's book. It was uncomfortable for everyone. My hands danced on. The line had to move around me. Occasionally, he looked up at me, bewildered. Once he smiled at me the way you smile at an idiot, but my hands fought to tell him everything, at least as much as they could before a security guard grasped me by the elbow and escorted me out. So this passage is so interesting. I analyze it 3 different ways. I don't know if I have time to do it right now. One of them is through Zvi's coughing, though, this idea that the body sort of manifests silence in this physical way and sort of tries to speak for itself. Okay, so one of the important things that I think we need to do before we can sort of get into what I want to say about sort of a positive use of silence in order to reach this sort of transcendent state of being is just to address like different strengths and weaknesses of silence and speech. So there's this interesting piece by Leo. It's about the death of the writer Isaac Babel, sort of an obituary. And in this piece, this writer just becomes obsessed with silence. So Babel starts only listening to the rest stops music. He starts to sort of obsess over blank space on pages. He just fills manuscripts with blank pages. And his wife asks, hey, do you still love me? His children ask him, is there a God? He won't say anything because he's committed to this intense silence. And then he faces the executioners because, as you might know, Isaac Babel was in fact executed. In this story, he faces the executioners, and it reads, he wondered if what he had taken for the richness of silence was really the poverty of never being heard. He thought the possibilities of human silence were endless, but as the bullets tore from the rifles, his body was riddled with the truth. And a small part of him laughed bitterly because, anyway, how could he have forgotten what he had always known? There is no match for the silence of God. So you sort of see this coming to terms with the fact that silence isn't actually like capable of doing everything that you want it to do. Silence is sort of fundamentally not enough for us in our sort of endeavors, and actually can just turn into the poverty of never being heard. On the other hand, Leo sort of experiences the opposite, where he goes from thinking that speech can do everything. So old Alma at one point asks him, when will you learn there isn't a word for everything? Because he sort of has this like sort of naive idea that words can do everything, right? Like Babel had this idea that silence can do everything. And then it's actually when he's like hiding outside of his house as his mother and brother are being shot by the Nazis inside. He's hiding, he gets away because he hid outside in the woods. He writes, when I got up again, I'd shed the only part of me that had ever thought I'd find words for even the smallest bit of life. So in both of these times, you see that this really big sort of life moment, right, death in both cases, sort of makes these characters realize that there are limits both to silence and to speech. So my question is, how can we use silence and speech sort of together, but, you know, sort of focusing on silence because we all know kind of what speech can do, right? But how do we use silence specifically in conjunction with speech as a relational tool that can kind of create this positive bridging between us and the other? So the first example that I want to use is that of a character named Bird. So Bird is the brother of young Alma. So they're both young Jews. At the end of the book, she's 14, he's 12, living in New York City. And so Bird and Alma are sort of playing this game when they're young. Sort of like you all know this image, it's not a pipe. They sort of play that except different. So they would say, this is not paper. They point to like objects in the room and they deny them. And Alma says that they denied everything. They denied years, they denied houses, they denied ideas, they denied everything. And then finally Bird says, I have not been unhappy my whole life, which is maybe his attempt to communicate with words at this point, but it doesn't work. Because Alma's response is, but you're only 8, or maybe, but you're only 7. Which is like he's sort of trying to use language in order to express something, but the negation, then she also negates that. She's like, but no, right? So then he grows up, he becomes convinced that he's a Lamed Vovnik, which is one of the 36 holy people in the Jewish tradition who are like the world depends on them. And so he's like, okay, I'm a Lamed Vovnik. And at this point, his sister Alma is like, dude, you really just need to try to be normal. Like, this is not going to make you friends. You're being weird. Like, you just have to sort of like keep this religious stuff on the down low. So she's like, you have to stop building the ark in, the alley behind our house. You have to just like try to be chill. Effectively silencing him, right? And that doesn't work either. So him trying to speak doesn't work. Him trying to be silent also doesn't really work. Like, he tries it for a bit, and it, like, he still sort of feels this way, and is still unhappy. Finally, this thing happens where he tries to go off on a plane. He tries to run away, and he gets taken back and has this really intense moment with his only friend, Mr. Goldstein, who's the janitor at the Jewish school. And I don't have the quote here, but I'll just read it to you. So Mr. Goldstein realizes what Bird has done. He's disappointed. And so Bird writes in his diary of Mr. Goldstein, his lips were moving, but I couldn't hear what they were saying, so I listened harder. I put my ear right to his mouth, and he said, Chaim, which is the name he calls me. A Lamed Vovnik is humble and works in secret, and then he turned away. And I understood that the thing he was crying about was me. So this is a really intense moment for Bird, where all of a sudden he has this different conception of his religion and himself in relation to it. He's been running around telling everyone he's a Lamed Vovnik. And all of a sudden he's like, well, wait, a Lamed Vovnik works in secret. I should work in secret. And so but then he thinks, wait, maybe I'm not a Lamed Vovnik after all, because I disappointed Mr. Goldstein, I disappointed God. And he has this sort of a crisis / epiphany where he decides, okay, what I'll do is I'll do one good thing for someone in secret. And so he actually sets up his sister Alma and Leo meeting. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it's, I think, really interesting because his idea is like, okay, if I can do this thing in secret, then maybe I will actually be a Lamed Vovnik and God will start listening to my prayers, because God only listens to Lamed Vovniks for some reason. So he has this idea that through silence, with also some speech, pulling people together, but being quiet about who he is, that he can sort of fundamentally change the reality of his own self and become this thing that he wants to be. Okay. Second one is about Alma and Leo. So they meet up, and I think at this point I want to talk about Buber. I probably should have brought him in earlier because I understand that this is a philosophy paper. But so as we all know, thanks to lots of great presentations in the past week, Buber has two sort of states of being that he proposes. One is the I-it, which is a world of sort of experiencing, and the other is the I-thou, which is about relationality, and you sort of lose yourself in this like incredible experience of the thou. So I contend that Leo has sort of always been moving around in the world of I-it. He, without giving too much away about the book, also, I'm so sorry, I'm doing lots of spoilers. You guys should all read this book, it's a great book. But anyways, so he's sort of, his mind is a little bit, he knows that his mind is a little bit questionable, and he doesn't actually know what the difference is between reality and what he's making up. So because of this, anything that he sees can just be like something that he's made up. So he really goes through the world in I-it. We're also told by Buber that it is always in the past, whereas I thou is always an experience that you have in the present. So Leo's sort of living in the past, in this realm of things that like are all kind of just in his head. He's like this sort of intense solipsism. And then he meets Alma. And at first he thinks that, oh geez, can you guys hear me? Oh, okay, sorry. My computer was like AirPod speaker or something. So then he meets Alma and she asks him this question. She's like, hey, were you in love with a girl named Alma once? And this, has this really incredible effect on him where he realizes that she's a real person. And he has this sort of beginning of an I thou moment with her where all of a sudden he's like, whoa, there's a real person. And it's actually like, she's actually looking at me, because he's sort of lived in this like silent and like invisible world for so long. And he's really struck dumb, like he can't speak. And he says, I wanted to say her name aloud. It would have given me joy to call, yet I couldn't speak. This is like pretty much the last page of the book. I was afraid I'd choose the wrong sentence. And so Alma is like sort of, she asks him some questions and he can't speak. And then this is sort of the culmination. He taps her twice, which as we know as readers is his code. Once means no, twice means yes. This is like a thing that he does. I tapped her twice, then twice again. She reached for my hand with the other. I tapped her twice. She squeezed my fingers. I tapped her twice. She put her head on my shoulder. I tapped her twice. She put one arm around me. I tapped her twice. She put both arms around me and hugged me. I stopped tapping. Alma, I said. She said, yes. Alma, I said again. She said, yes. Alma, I said. She tapped me twice. So I love this passage. I think it's genius and wonderful and amazing. But I think what's really important to note is that Alma, she tries speaking with him and it's clearly not working. And then what she tries after that is this sort of silent physical motion, which is really sort of like groundbreaking to him, and then she uses his language, like she sort of learns this tapping communication. And so we have communication both in this silent realm and in this verbal realm, and they sort of have this wonderful moment, I think, of like a really pure I thou moment where they can sort of see each other and be present with each other. Okay, the last, I have three. The very last relationship that I think that this book creates for us to be seen as using silence as a positive relational tool is between us as readers and history. So let me slow down slightly. So there is this great article by Jessica Lang. It's called The History of Love, the Contemporary Reader and the Transmission of Holocaust Memory. And she situates this book in a third generation of Holocaust novels, Holocaust literature, meaning that its work is really to balance history, which is already sort of removed by generations, with immediacy. So she mentions this one moment in the book right before the quote that I just read. So it's between Leo and Alma, but he still thinks that she's in his head. He thinks she's an angel. And the quote is, from Leo's perspective, I thought, so this is how they send the angel, stalled at the age when she loved you most. And it's this you that Lang points out, rightly, is really interesting because me makes way more sense. But she says you, and this sort of draws us into a connectedness with the story and actually draws Leo sort of out closer to us. So she says the you is all encapsulating. It refers to Alma and Leo, certainly, and also to a more collective set of eyes witnessing this meeting, namely to those who are reading about it. Indeed, the you suggests that Leo has joined readers in reading the novel of his own making. So Leo is sort of drawn out into us, and we're sort of drawn into the novel. And so this novel, it's really interesting. The last section, it's all like, this is Leo and this is Alma. And there's a lot of, firstly, they're sort of looking at each other because each section on each page is like one from each of their perspective. And there's a lot of, if you notice, like blank space on these pages. So I think that the experience that we're having when we read these last few pages of the book is really intensely sort of to have to come to terms with the silence that's in these pages, sort of like the silence that Babel filled pages with, blank pages, that there's a lot of blank space on these like physical pages. And so we, when we're reading those, then have to reckon with all that's not written down, with all the other perspectives of Jews during the Shoah who aren't represented on these pages, with, you know, all the things that aren't said about these characters. And we sort of come to terms with this immensity of history that we don't have access to. So really, really quickly, I know I'm pretty much out of time. There's this great piece that Alma, she's writing, she has this journal, she writes this list of memories passed down from her father, and one of them is the sound of cicadas at night and also the silence. And then she has a list of memories passed down from her mother, and one of them is the great silence and the empty fields of Israel, and also the sound of the insects her first night at kibbutz Yavne, which gave depth and dimension to the silence and emptiness. And then on the next page, there's this quote, which I love, where she's sort of thinking about it. And she says, I lay in the dark and the silence, which was nothing like the dark and the silence my father lay in as a boy in a house on a dirt street in Tel Aviv, or the dark and silence my mother lay in on her first night at kibbutz Yavne, but which held those darknesses and those silences too. And so I propose that when we're reading this book, it's our job to sort of imagine this like giant silence of history, which is broken by sort of the cicadas of language and of books like this. And it's our job to imagine sort of that our experience is holding this whole history, and that we can sort of stand on essentially the ground of history and have this sort of transcendent like ownership in our bodies and our lived experience of this huge past.